Well, hi, Kate. Many thanks for joining me. I am not in Wisconsin, but you are.
Thank you for having me. Yes, we're in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah, which is I was describing it earlier as the sort of, in many ways, the legal capital. It's
Certain,
where,
hmm Yep, certainly a lot of lawyers are here. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, 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 yeah. I'm I'm not in Wisconsin, despite the flag, which is the Charlie Berens version of
oh,
the
I just
state flag.
noticed that.
Yeah, it's not the it's not the real one.
That's so funny.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm married to someone from the Northwoods, so we are
Oh,
big Charlie Berens fans around
yes.
here.
Yeah. 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 No, he actually sent me a signed photograph to Paul on the box.
Funny.
Yeah. Yeah. It's. I'll dig it out somewhere. I'll go over that one again. But yes, it's great to have you on. And really, today's topic. Well, I'll let you introduce today's topic if you would, please, Kate.
Of course, yeah. Well, despite it being a lot of fun to see your Charlie Berens flag, it's a really serious topic.
Sure.
We're here to talk about forensic science reform, and how bad forensic science contributes to wrongful convictions.
Yeah.
That's the primary focus of our organization, the Center for Integrity in Forensic Sciences.
Sure. Sure. And well, I suppose most people know about some of the most sort of bizarre cases, but would you like to share with us some of your experiences of some of the worst, sort of needs of forensic, when things go really wrong? I mean,
Sure. Sure. So, to give you some background, what we know from studying wrongful convictions is that about 25% of all wrongful convictions, and that's individuals in the National Registry of Exonerations who were convicted, later shown to be innocent. About a quarter of those have bad forensic science, and that can run the gamut. So sometimes it's actually fraud. There are forensic scientists who have been known to commit fraud, but more commonly it's things that are in some ways more insidious, but in some ways less so, right? So it's not necessarily somebody doing something that they know that it is wrong. It's people overstating their level of confidence, for example, right?
yes.
Overstating the likelihood that a piece of evidence can be correlated with a standard.
Sure.
And in fact, when we look at those cases that involve bad forensic science, over half of them, about 60%, have an analyst who cited, they didn't lie necessarily, they just presented the evidence with more certainty than the science warranted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I must admit, I do struggle with this idea that in a court proceeding, you would have experts testifying for the prosecution and experts testifying for the defense, as if there's two different sort of analysis of whatever's presented. There's surely some common ground.
Well, one thing that scientists have identified as a serious problem is the issue of forensic science organizations and crime labs being housed within police organizations.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so what that does is we do have an adversarial legal system, and that's by necessity, right?
Yeah.
But it's not necessary for any kind of science that's used to convict people to be part of the law enforcement structure, because that can give rise to a really commonly recognized bias called role effects bias, where analysts begin to see themselves as part of the prosecution team, and then they make decisions as part of the prosecution team rather than as objective scientists.
Well, yeah, I mean, we only need to look at Sherry Culhane being told to, place Teresa in his garage or trailer, and it's like, what? That's just like,
So one one really serious problem in forensic sciences are disciplines that arose as a way to catch criminals, right? So things
Yeah,
that arose away from the lab bench and as part of police organizations, like they all have problems. But there's actually another area of forensic science that we don't think about a lot, but it is no less serious, which is this sort of these examples of testing structures that are created for a particular case, right? So in a recent amicus brief that our organization submitted, there was evidence in a case in Massachusetts about poor patterns of paint and the speed with which the paint would be expected to dry. And that was used to establish a cause of death in a case.
sure.
And that's not a recognized forensic science discipline. And so what we told the court in our brief as a friend of the court was, even though the safeguards provided by established forensic disciplines are inadequate, these testing schemes that are sort of a one-off, that are developed for the purposes of one case, lack even those inadequate safeguards.
I'm going to say, I mean, if you develop a test for a one-off case, surely that needs to be replicated by loads of forensic scientists, not just in America, but all over the world. And then you can say, yes, you can sort of quantify something. But to come up with a one-off test, it's just
right.
It's just bizarre, isn't it? I mean, obviously, I sent you that article about the this. We often hear it, don't we, in courts, within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty. I mean, what's your take on that particular use and term?
Yeah, it's a really problematic term because not only does it have, very little objective scientific meaning, right? People interpret it differently. Everyone has a different, without a standardized definition, people are free to interpret it in many different ways. And those underlying assumptions are not always made clear to juries, right? And it makes them sound like they're very certain, but no one interrogates that certainty. So for example, in a study of medical professionals, some of them thought that term meant more than 90% certainty, while others thought it meant more than 50% certainty. Yeah. That's a huge gulf, right? And that's something that juries don't understand when you use the term reasonable degree of scientific or medical certainty. That's not, it's one of these underlying assumptions that remains hidden from the person trying to make the decision.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have problems with that on two fronts. First of all, how do you quantify a reasonable degree of scientific certainty? As you've just said, is it 90%? Is it 50%? There's no standard. So, it's a bogus quote in the first place. But also, to me, it suggests that, therefore, because you're saying within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that it obviously says, well, that there's elements of doubt there.
Yeah.
And when
I think that's an important issue.
Sorry.
Well, and certainly there are elements of doubt. It's not only an imprecise term, it's also a very old term that was adopted without a great deal of, thought or consideration. And it hasn't been thoroughly re-examined within the context of the world we now live in, where we have much better ways of presenting science in court. We know more. I can't remember the number, but there's some excellent statistic out there about like the rate at which human knowledge of science is increasing. And it's something almost unbelievable, like it's doubling every day or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And so given all of that, the fact that we're using a term that was kind of coined for use in court, that, was adopted as an evidentiary standard without very much consideration of what it actually meant, that doesn't have a standard definition. And, this determines whether jurors who are responsible for determining the credibility of a witness believe a witness. So it is in many ways critical.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem bizarre, doesn't it, that you know, these experts are being asked within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, to which they don't themselves know what the standard is, and yet the jury are expected to go with that.
Mhm.
It's like,
Mhm.
it's like, you know, you've got experts, but then the jury aren't experts. They're not necessarily going to understand all the complexities of the you know, what is being presented as forensic evidence. Um,
Oh, sorry, I
sorry,
was just going to say, well, that's only one example of these terms that get used without without a really clear understanding of the assumptions underlying them. So
right.
another issue we see in a lot of these cases, including in wrongful convictions, is the statements that sound statistical in nature, but that do not have underlying data that support them, right? So sometimes we might call that you know, like a hidden probabilistic determination.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So somebody who says, oh, it's more likely to be this, or this is very rare. It sounds very convincing. And the person often backs that statement up with, well, I know that because I've been doing this work for 20 years. But the truth is, if we don't know how rare something is, we can't say that one thing is more rare than another.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose the other thing that really gets up my goat, you know, to use a popular Wisconsin expression, I date, is the fact that, you know, you've got these experts that come on and testify.
Yeah.
And then you've got the likes of your Ken Kratz and your Jim Hardings of this world, that then they get away with literally with murder because they're burying people alive by the way they twist this, you know, what's been said in court, and they put a whole different spin on what's been, you know, what's been presented in the you know, by the expert who, you know, it's sometimes that, you know, they're not all I mean, one of my worst favorites would be Dwayne Deaver in The Staircase. You know, his blood spatter experiments, ridiculous, but, you know, completely he was completely banned, you know, thrown out, wasn't he? And Michael West and some of these other people. But some of the experts, you know, they're trying to do their best, but then you get it being twisted by, you know, by prosecution attorneys that just go completely overboard with what they're, you know, that they're saying to the jury. So you understand. I kind of understand why the jury, you know, sometimes end up convicting, because again, you know, why would the accused be there? You know, why would he have been arrested? It's but there was
well, responsible scientific testimony is really important, and so is responsible argument, right? So prosecutors have an obligation not to go beyond what the evidence and the science can support, and they can make reasonable inferences in argument, but they can't invent facts, right? And so in cases where that happens, you know, the accused person deserves a new trial, and you can't have a fair trial if the science presented to prosecute you is not good, right? That's not a fair trial. And so, yeah, it's really important that cases are that the testimony is appropriate and also that argument is appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, that's that you've just summed up the whole Stephen Avery case in one beautifully coined phrase there, haven't you? You know, that's exactly what should happen. I really wanted to ask you a little bit though about how the Centre for Integrity of Forensic Science, how did it come about? How did it, you know, how did it start out? How did you get involved with it? And what is it that it's sort of you know, doing? What's its aims, its functions, if you like?
Yeah, so the Center for Integrity and Forensic Sciences was started by Jerry Buting, Dean Strang, and Keith Finley in 2018.
Yep.
And I was hired in 2019 from the Wisconsin Innocence Project, where I had been a staff attorney specializing in complicated forensic science cases.
Right. Wow.
Previously, before that, I was a litigation coordinator at the Innocence Network, which is the organization of 69 worldwide innocence efforts. And I coordinated, again, complex forensic science litigation there. I did a lot of cases when I was at the Innocence Network dealing with shaken baby syndrome and other types of complex medical cases. And then when I was at the University of Wisconsin, I did more of those, but I also, expanded into some other kinds of forensic cases. My background as a trial lawyer before I started doing innocence work was also doing complex forensic science cases. I did misdemeanor, felony, and capital crimes in New Mexico before the abolition of the death penalty there, and then came back to Wisconsin. This is where I'm close to where my family is from. I'm from Chicago, but that's kind of my background. And they wanted a lawyer to head up the organization, and a lawyer who had a really good sense of not only what the trends were in this kind of litigation, but also who the players were, and where we could make inroads, where we could educate, where we could help with policy decisions. And so what the organization does is we work on three fronts, right? So we work on education, we work on policy, and we work on direct representation. So what that means is we teach lawyers, law students, other graduate students, judges, and the public about forensic science and forensic science error, right, where it can go wrong. We advocate for forensic science reform, and it's a little bit of a misnomer to call direct representation sort of a third leg of that stool, because really what we aim to do in our direct representation is to help in specific cases, help educate. We represent the client, of course, and they're our primary concern in that type of a situation. But a big part of that is moving the needle forward with specific cases. So showing, where forensic science went wrong in a specific case. And to that end, primarily when we represent someone, we'd be doing it on like post-conviction litigation, very similar to what innocence efforts do, although we are not a solely innocence-focused organization. Our view is that while bad forensic science can certainly convict the innocent, and it's a serious problem, everyone deserves a fair trial, no matter whether they're guilty or innocent. And it's also really important that we don't try to prejudge who's innocent or who's guilty. We just make sure that everyone gets a fair trial.
Yeah, absolutely. I must admit, I was impressed with your CV there. I fear that you were quite a geek at school.
It's true.
Yeah, I really flunked at all the sort of sciences, physics, chemistry, biology. I was the only one in my class that had to do general science, which was like an easier version of all three. So I am in total awe of anybody that's got this back. I knew a couple of the band members. One was right into physics and one was right into chemistry. And listening to them having a conversation, I was like, I have no idea what they're on about. But it's interesting, you were talking about the, sort of litigating certain cases, so, when the, I think you just mentioned a while back that you've just presented an amicus brief, an amicus curiae in a case to do with the drying of paint.
Yes. So we've provided amicus support in, I have not looked at my spreadsheet, right? Because of course I have a spreadsheet because I'm a big nerd. Lately to see which ones, where we are in which stages of litigation, but I could be incorrect about this, but I believe we filed amicus briefs to date in something like 12 different cases, and they run the gamut. They're cases involving DNA analysis that we have concerns about, because of course, even though DNA is the most reliable forensic science discipline, it doesn't mean it can never be wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
And the process used is really important to think about, and the testimony given is really important to think about. So we've done some DNA cases. We've looked at those kinds of issues. We've worked on some child abuse cases where, a child had an illness or an injury and it was misdiagnosed as child abuse. And we've done, a number of other cases, but the one about the paint was a homicide case in Massachusetts, where after 2 hung juries, so they tried this person 3 times and she was convicted the 3rd time, but the first 2 trials resulted in juries that couldn't make a decision. They couldn't come to a conclusion one way or the other. And they brought in for the third trial this additional evidence in the form of an analyst who testified to how quickly it might take a certain type of paint to dry. And we had really significant concerns about that case. We were really concerned about the structure of the underlying experimentation. And we were really concerned about statements that tended to, or straight up did, make assumptions about the intent of the person who either like spilled or poured the paint. So that's something that we've seen in multiple different contexts. And it's a little bit harder a problem to get your arms around, because it's not like bite mark examination, right? Which has a significant number of problems, and those problems are relatively well known.
Yeah.
And we can sort of lump those cases together and say these suffer from many of the same problems. Of course, not every case is the same, and there's always going to be differences, but we can lump them together and we can say, okay, these cases suffer from many of the same issues. On the other hand, these cases that are just sort of one thing created for one case, it's hard to see the trends and see the ways in which the development of these experimental techniques that are maybe used once or twice are problematic. So one thing we're really concerned about as an organization is creating a framework for when these techniques do emerge. How will we assess them? How will we help lawyers figure out whether they're any good? How can we help judges figure out whether juries should hear about them? Because of course, that's a very important function of judges. Every fact in the case doesn't come before a jury. You have a court acting as the gatekeeper to say, this is appropriate for the jury to consider, or this is not appropriate for the jury to consider. And when it's science, it's really difficult. So many courts have real difficulty figuring out what should and shouldn't be admissible, especially when it's scientific evidence. That's really hard for a lot of folks.
Yeah, sure. Couple of things there that you mentioned. What was interesting, you mentioned Massachusetts. So your center doesn't just deal with cases in Wisconsin.
No, we're a nationwide organization.
Wow.
And have consulted on cases actually in other countries too.
Wow, that's really good. I mean, yeah, going back to some of the stuff like the bite mark analysis. I mean, is there any justification for it? From the point of view of excluding people, rather than, to prove that somebody wasn't the person that did it.
I know that some lawyers and experts have suggested that it could be used to exclude rather than include someone.
Yeah.
I think that while I am less concerned about it being used as an exclusionary technique, there just isn't evidence supporting that an expert can reliably make that kind of determination.
Yeah. I mean, it's just bizarre when you realize that it's snappy turtles, or it's, some sort of pond life that's caused the marks. And, you've got your Michael West saying, indeed and without doubt, these are the teeth of somebody.
Yeah, a famous Wisconsin case involving a bite mark is really illustrative of this point. In that case, the person who actually did the homicide and the person who was convicted had different numbers of teeth, right? So, yeah. So, in a situation like that, you're talking about you could potentially be talking about the right person being improperly excluded. And that's a concern. You certainly don't want, you don't want those folks to be excluded. And there are other issues, while in general, forensic odontology it's complicated, right? Because bite mark matching lacks scientific validity, but there are acceptable uses of dentists in forensic science, identifying a disfigured body, for example, identifying a victim of, a natural disaster or plane crash or something like that, where it's not possible to identify them in the normal way, normal way. And that might be an appropriate use, but there are also other inappropriate uses that have been sort of sneaking around on the periphery now of forensic odontology, including the fairly unreliable practice of trying to determine somebody's age for the purposes of immigration with their dental records, which is also potentially fraught with error. Yeah, so there are some really significant problems there.
Yeah, I think I actually I've just acquired a new dog, and just in the last 8 weeks, and as viewers will know, I've posted a few videos about him. On Monday, I took him to the vets for his first checkup, and I mentioned about his teeth, and the vet said, yeah, no, you cannot age dogs by their teeth. The only ones you can are horses. Apparently with horses, you do have a chance of sort of establishing an age of them by the teeth. But I was also.
But I also feel like I'm a horse person. I also feel like every horse person has a story of like, oh yeah, they looked at his teeth and they told me he was 5 and he was something else. You know?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I don't know.
For every true case, there's a few others that aren't quite right, aren't there?
Right. And that's the challenge, right? Whenever we're doing anything that's subjective, there is going to be an error rate. And that doesn't mean that we should never trust something with an error rate. I mean, we have physicians in this country who do wonderful things on behalf of cancer patients, right?
Sure.
But there's an error rate there too.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that when you are diagnosed with cancer, you shouldn't get care. It means that we should study the error rate and endeavor to make it lower, endeavor to figure out where our problems are, right? And so the same thing is true of forensic sciences. There are some things, that we should abandon, that we can be pretty confident at this point they don't work. But, in other cases, if we don't know yet, right, and we think they might work, but we don't have all the numbers, we should be working to determine, where we can improve, what we can say. Because, like, for example, there may be uses, right, for hair comparison microscopy, but what we certainly cannot say any longer is that two hairs, is it the hair from the crime scene and the hair from the suspect match? Yeah. Right? Can't say that anymore.
No, it's ridiculous. Another thing I was going to ask you, because you mentioned this about helping lawyers, and I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to suggest it's probably more defense lawyers that you help, but it would be nice if it was prosecution lawyers that you were also helping to raise the standard of forensic integrity. Is it mainly defense lawyers that you're involved with?
We've done trainings and consultation work for prosecution organizations,
right?
But for the most part, the majority of our work is done with the defense bar. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that kind of doesn't surprise me. As I say, I do find it at times. I cannot get my head around the fact that you would have experts testifying for the defense and experts for the prosecution. It's supposed to be science. I mean, how can you have two different opinions? And you've even got cases where it seems to be weighed up on, if you've got more experts, you've got a better chance of winning.
I mean, I think sometimes that's true. It shouldn't be. But the important thing about science is not that everybody agrees, right? It's not that there are many legitimate disagreements in the scientific community. The issue is just when we overstate them, when we give them more weight than they deserve, and we use techniques in ways that we shouldn't. Those are sort of the biggest issues here. But certainly some dispute is necessary and appropriate. There are ways to move forward with legitimate scientific disputes. It's just that we have to be honest about what they are and what they mean.
Sure. I realise time's pushing on. I've kept you for nearly half an hour now. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, if people wanted to help support the Centre for Integrity of Forensic Sciences. How would one go about doing that? And I can pop the link.
Yeah, so I'll give you all of that information if you don't already have it to be posted in the show notes or however you like to do it. But we're on all social media at CIFS Justice, Center for Integrity of Forensic Sciences, CIFS Justice. Yeah. We're online at cifsjustice.org.
Yep.
And you can follow us on social media. Where we're most active is Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.
Yep.
And learn about these issues. It's really important. And so when things come up, I mean, you can be a more educated juror and more educated member of your community. If you're asked to serve on a jury, I mean, certainly in the US, right, you can be someone who's learned that not all forensic science is accurate and without error. So that's certainly a way, to learn more about the work and support us. You can also give, and there's a link at our website to make donations to us. And that's, of course, something that really keeps us going. We're an independent organization, and it's really important that we're supported by a broad base of private donors rather than, any one particular industry.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine, to say this, but it's probably a kind of a bit competitive with, when you've got so much, like the, as you say, innocence projects out there, and but yeah, the forensic sciences for me, I hate to say this, but I was, when I watched Making a Murderer, it was one of these things that I thought, when are we going to get a proper expert to come in and say, there's no way Teresa Halbach was cremated in a bonfire in 3 hours. It was just I was crying out for some sort of forensic expert to come in and talk about this, and it just begged belief to me that these sort of things could happen. But then as I found out more and more about other cases, you discover what's gone on, and what's passed as sort of this is being passed on as science. And as you're saying, the more information you get, the more you can, at some point, if you're ever in a discussion with somebody, if you've got the information and the facts of these cases, and you can say, if somebody says, well, that wouldn't have happened, you can say, well, yeah, that was exactly what happened in this case. Whether it be your paint drying or your bite mark analysis, or claiming that somebody could be reduced to ash in 3 hours in a bonfire. It's just ridiculous.
Well, it's also a bit complicated, right? Because it's very rare that forensic science gives you all of the information you need to prosecute or defend a case. When you look at a case and you use forensic science to inspect it, you might get some information about important parts of the case. You might, for example, find DNA evidence that puts, someone's DNA at the crime scene, or doesn't.
Yeah.
But it's really unusual to get anything that's that clear cut. And that's part of why it's so difficult and complicated, because there's always going to be some element of human interpretation, much like there is in medicine, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But so we can never take that away entirely. But what we can do is we can try to create safeguards, guardrails to make sure that we are not, at least we're not doing the things that are known to be wrong and lead to wrongful convictions. We can't, just like anything else, can't promise that it's going to be right all the time. But we can definitely take steps to improve, to reduce our bias, to improve the quality of the science being done, to improve the quality of the testimony being given, to make sure that judges, lawyers, people in the community, jurors, everyone understands both the limitations and the good attributes of the kind of science that's presented in courts.
Well, if I might just sort of say then, just in closing, that I mentioned off air, as it were, about the 2009 Strengthening Forensic Science report, which I've actually done a series of videos about, and which, to the best of my knowledge, was never actually acted upon, but it seems as if the Centre for the Integrity of forensic science has sort of taken up that baton and is running with it now, and is trying to do exactly the things that that paper was 2009, I believe it was, wasn't it?
2009, yeah. And when we really started to be an organization, it was almost a decade since it had been published. And interestingly, many of us in the forensic science community, the forensic science reform community, really thought, I remember I was litigating cases at, in trials at the time. And I remember reading it and thinking, this is going to be a game changer. This is going to make sure that I stop seeing just bogus stuff in the courtroom. And it didn't. It's been adopted in a piecemeal way that results in something a really much smarter than me colleague of mine has called fluky justice, right? It means that it just depends on where you are, right? Like who the lawyers are, what jurisdiction you're in, whether these like good forensic science practices are going to be something that you get to benefit from. And interestingly, in 2016, President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology released another report that was meant to help push that forward, to help adopt some of these reforms. And that too was, first of all, it was met with a great deal of hostility from the community of prosecutors and law enforcement. And many of those reforms, those suggested reforms have not, aren't in place now. So it continues. And I feel like every year we maybe move the ball forward, but it's not as fast as, reformers would hope. And it's not as fast as people deserve. People who are accused of crimes and people who are victims of crimes and anyone who is touched by the criminal legal system deserves fairness, justice.
Yeah, I do apologize for that. My wife has just returned back from bingo. She likes to play bingo on a Thursday night, and the dog is pleased to see her, so hence the barking.
Well, I think I had a train outside my window earlier, so I cannot complain. My own dog has been very quiet, which is good because sometimes he's happy.
Kate, it's been absolutely brilliant. It's Katherine or Kate?
I go by Kate.
Kate, yeah. It's been absolutely brilliant having you on. If there's one thing I'm going to take away from, most important is, as you pointed out, it's the way that experts overstate. And this for me is the big problem, particularly if a case does rely just on, from the juror's point of view, what the experts say, and they've overstated. I think we can see exactly that, the sort of problems that can produce. So thank you so much for coming on. I will post the link to the Center for the Integrity of Forensic Science in the description in the video, which will probably be, I'll schedule it for tomorrow, Friday evening, probably around about 4:00 Wisconsin time.
Okay. Would be
a good time to do that. So I'm going to say cheerio. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And I hope you're successful in the various cases that you're trying to help, particularly the paint drying one.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.